Hello everyone, welcome to Drishti IAS. You're watching the NCERT Foundation Series wherein we study the subject of political science with the help of MCQs and PYQs wherever relevant. So today we'll be covering the remaining portion or the second half of our class 11 chapter 3. And without further ado, let's plunge right in. So let's take a look at the previous day question. Which of the following is common to the method of election of the members of Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha? So, first let's refresh our memory. Alright, we discussed that while electing the members of the Rajya Sabha, it's the MLAs that cast their vote. So, the method is indirect, and we also discussed that it is preference based. And here, while talking about the Lok Sabha, we discussed that they use the method of, or the voters elect the candidates, and the methodology is first past the post system, where the candidate with the maximum amount of votes wins the election. This method over here is known as proportional representation via the single transferable vote. This is the basics that we need to know about Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha election, and we covered it in fair amount of detail in the preceding video. Now let's look at the options and decide which is the correct answer. Option A says every citizen above the age of 18 is an eligible voter. While this is true for the case of Lok Sabha, because we have adopted the universal adult franchisee, but this is true only for the Lok Sabha, because for the Rajya Sabha, not every citizen votes, only the MLAs vote, because it is an indirect election, alright. So we can rule out this element. Option B says voter can give preference order for different candidates. Again, preference order has to do with Rajya Sabha. We discussed in the preceding lecture that when the members have to be elected and the vacant seats are to be filled for the Rajya Sabha, then the MLAs list out candidates in the order of their preference, alright, or they mark their preference against the names of the candidates. However, this is not the case with Lok Sabha elections, where every voter has to cast a vote for single candidate with no order of preference. Option C says every vote has equal value. This is indeed correct for both the elections. For the first past the post system or the Lok Sabha or the General Assembly elections, we have discussed in a lot of detail in quite a few lectures in the past that of course every person gets one single vote and every vote has the same value, alright. Even in the case of MPs, while we were discussing the proportional MPs of the Rajya Sabha, while we were discussing the proportional representation system, we realized that every MLA has the same votes, alright. However, the votes may differ, the value may be different with respect to different states, because obviously the number of vacant seats as well as the number of MLAs would vary state to state. However, within the same electoral college, within the same state, of course, every candidate's vote has the same value. So this is common to both your Lok Sabha as well as the Rajya Sabha elections. And therefore, option C is the correct answer. Let's look at option D. The winner must get more than half the vote. This is not a condition for either of the two elections. Hence, option C is the correct answer. The next question says, the British era separate electorate system is different from India's present reserved constituency system because. Now let's first discuss what is India's present reserved constituency system. So let us first try to understand the concept of reserved constituency. Now this reserved constituency is decided by, or which constituency is to be reserved is decided by the Delimitation Commission. The Delimitation Commission. Now, in India, we know that the first past the post system is followed. Here, a candidate who secures the maximum votes or the majority, let's say maximum votes, wins the election. But it is very likely that a candidate who has more influence by virtue either of his religion or of his community in some form or of his caste, particularly in India, caste discrimination plays a very important role. So maybe his caste also plays a role in his election. So it's very likely that the community which is in majority will have its candidates winning the elections consistently, whereas certain communities which are either in minority or are marginalized in some form of another or other are going to not be represented. So in order to deal with this problem, and we have to give credit to our constitution makers, they had good foresight, they had the foresight to see that such a problem may arise. So to deal with this problem, they came up with the idea of reserved constituencies. So after every census, the Delimitation Commission is mandated with redrawing the boundaries of all constituencies. Wherever the Delimitation Commission sees that there is more population of SCs and STs, the scheduled tribes and the scheduled castes, those constituencies are marked as or selected as or considered reserved constituencies. Now, what is to be noted over here is that the seat, this constituency, the seat is reserved for a candidate belonging to the scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. Alright, so the seat is reserved for candidate belonging to either of the two communities. Our constitution has provisions for these two communities at the moment. Now, of course, the seats are reserved, but who votes in these elections? Do only the people belonging to the community vote? No. Everybody belonging to all classes, all strata, all communities are going to vote for this candidate. But the candidate himself should belong to the reserved community. This is what makes it different from what we know as separate electorates. Now, the concept of separate electorates was introduced during the pre-independence era and during the times of the British. So, here what was the concept? The concept was that we'll keep separate candidates, we'll reserve constituencies. The candidates would belong to the reserved communities, but only voters from that community are going to vote for that candidate. This, of course, could lead to serious problems and serious demarcations in the society. And again, like I said, our forefathers were very well aware that such a situation might arise, and therefore they came up with the idea of reserved constituency, which means that all people are going to, everybody in that constituency, irrespective of their strata, their community, their religion, are going to, or their caste, are going to vote for these candidates. The candidate will represent all the people in the constituency and not only his community. And that came up as a perfect solution to the concept of separate electorates, which was introduced by the, or suggested by the British. Now, with this background, let's try and look at our question. So we have to find out about how this concept of separate electorate is different from reserved constituency. Option A says both voters and candidates were from the same community in the former, but only candidates are so in the latter. And this incidentally happens to be your correct answer. Of course, in the separate electorate system, like we discussed, both the voters as well as the candidates had to belong to a certain community. And this was definitely likely to be a cause of problems. Whereas when we talk about reserved constituencies, we notice that our candidate, the victorious candidate, represents everybody in that constituency, irrespective of their religion, community, and caste. Option B says in both systems only community-specific voters could vote. No, we just discussed the difference. C option says the reserved constituency system allows only majority communities to vote. This is in fact the exact opposite of the purpose of the reserved constituency. And option D says both systems restrict representation to dominant castes. Again, false. And therefore option A happens to be our correct answer. Question 2 says, with reference to reservation of constituencies for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, consider the following statements. Statement 1 says the number of seats reserved for SCs and STs in each state is proportional to their share in that state's population. This is in fact absolutely correct. So while we are talking about reservation of constituencies, let's consider a few points that might be useful for us to solve this problem. The first thing is that the reservation of constituencies takes place by the Delimitation Commission. And the Delimitation Commission works with the Election Commission of India. The Delimitation Commission with the Election Commission of India actually marks the constituencies as reserved. Now, of course, the number of seats reserved for SCs and STs in each state is proportional to their share of the population. What is the task of the Delimitation Commission, or what is the mandate of Delimitation Commission? Its primary mandate is to redraw boundaries of each constituencies in order to reflect proportionately the change in population after every census. So what happens here? When we are talking about these, here again the Delimitation Commission actually reserves seats in each state as per the population, that is of the SCs and STs in that state. So for example, if there are a total of 100 seats in that state and SCs are, let's say, 11% and STs are, let's say, 6%. So around 17 seats in this case are going to be reserved in this state by the Delimitation Commission. The second statement is the specific constituencies to be reserved are decided by the Election Commission of India. In fact, we have just read it is decided by the Delimitation Commission. With, of course, it works with the Election Commission of India, but the decision is final of the Delimitation Commission, and that decision has the force of a law. And that decision, the delimitations decision, is not subject to judicial review. Option 3 says, once reserved, a constituency permanently remains reserved for that category. Now, like I discussed before, our constitution has made provisions for the reservation of SCs and STs when we talk about reserved constituencies. In case of, while reserving constituencies for the STs, the delimitation considers the population, the Delimitation Commission considers the population of different constituencies, sees where the concentration of the STs is higher, and then marks that as reserved constituency for STs. And usually the scheduled tribes actually reside in nearby areas. If you notice the Northeast for that matter, or states like Orissa, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. So usually you will find that adjacent constituencies are reserved for the STs. However, when talking about SCs, or when considering reserving constituencies for SCs, the Delimitation Commission considers the population of SCs. Now, please understand that the scheduled castes are more evenly spread geographically throughout the country, unlike the scheduled tribes, which are particularly concentrated in certain areas. So, let's say when we are talking about UP, this is just a hypothetical example. When we are talking about UP, they will consider, the Delimitation Commission will consider which constituencies has higher population or relatively higher population of scheduled castes and mark it as reserved constituency. However, instead of marking this as adjacent, they will spread these more evenly throughout the state. So, for example, nearby constituencies have more population of SCs. Instead of marking these adjacent territories as reserved constituencies, the Delimitation Commission is going to spread it along the geography of the entire state, so that when the next time when the delimitation exercise happens again, other or different constituencies can be marked as your reserved constituencies for scheduled castes. So, once reserved, a constituency permanently remains reserved for that category? No, this is in fact incorrect, because like we said, because the population of the SCs in particular is evenly spread throughout the country, therefore there is a dispersion of reserved constituency throughout the state, and there might be a rotation of those reserved constituencies when the next time the exercise of delimitation takes place. Alright, so we will eliminate option or statement 2 and 3 here, and therefore arrive at the correct answer, which is option A, 1 only. Why does the Delimitation Commission ensure geographical dispersion of scheduled castes, reserved constituencies across a state? We have just discussed it. Because the SC population is generally evenly spread throughout the country. It's a very straightforward question once you have understood how the delimitation exercise takes place, especially in case of the reserved constituencies for scheduled castes. So there, option B is our correct answer. Which of the following statements about the Delimitation Commission is not correct? Now let's first try and understand a few things about the Delimitation Commission. So when talking about the Delimitation Commission, let's try and understand that the Delimitation Commission is actually a high-powered statutory body. It is not a constitutional body, but a high-powered statutory body. And the commission works closely with the Election Commission of India. Now, who all are a part of the Delimitation Commission? The commission is usually headed by a retired Supreme Court judge, the Election Commissioner of India, or other election commissioners, and it also usually has the state election commissioners. Now, we also ought to understand that its mandate is to redraw the boundaries of constituencies after census to reflect population change. Again, we also need to know that the decision or the orders of the Delimitation Commission have the force of law and they cannot be challenged in any court, which means that they are not subject to judicial review. They are not subject to judicial review. So with this information in mind, let's try and arrive at the correct answer. Notice that we are talking about what is not correct about the Delimitation Commission and not trying to find what is correct about it. A, it is appointed by the president. Yes, indeed, this is correct. The Delimitation Commission is in fact appointed by the president. It functions jointly with the Election Commission. Absolutely correct. We have just talked about it. Option C says its orders have to be approved by the Parliament. What did we just discuss? We just discussed that its orders have the force of law. And of course, they do not need to be approved by the Parliament. The orders itself have the force of law and they are not subject to any kind of judicial review. So this we can eliminate. This is in fact the correct answer that we are looking for. And option D says it decides which constituencies are to be reserved. Absolutely correct. So option C, by virtue of being wrong with respect to the Delimitation Commission, is the correct answer. Which of the following correctly states the tenure and removal conditions of the Chief Election Commissioner? Now let's talk a bit about the election commissioners. Now we know that Article 324 of the Constitution vests in an Election Commission of India the power or the authority to superintend direct and control the elections to the Lok Sabha, the Rajya Sabha, and of course the state legislative assemblies, along with the offices of the President and the Vice President. This power comes from Article 324. And of course, if we know that the Election Commission will be headed by an Election Commissioner. Now, usually it can either be a single member body or a multi-member body. At present, it is a multi-member body with 3 members, 1 Chief Election Commissioner plus 2 other election commissioners. Does it mean that the Chief Election Commissioner has more powers over election commissioners? No. They actually have similar powers. And to guarantee the security of their tenure, they are mandated to serve either for 6 years or up till they attain the age of 65 years, whichever is earlier. So if by the time they reach 62 years of age and they've already completed their tenure of 6 years, they will be retired. Or if they've only done 2 years but they've attained 65 years of age, they will still have to give up their position. Alright. Who appoints the Chief Election Commission or who appoints the election commissioners? The President. How does the President appoint them? Now, until recently, the President would appoint the election commissioners simply on the advice of the Council of Ministers. But in 2023, there was an amendment to the Act which is known as the Chief Election Commissioner and Other Election Commissioners Act, with which there was a selection committee which consisted of the PM, a leader of the opposition, and a cabinet minister or a union minister appointed by the PM, which appoint the election commissioners. So this happened after the 2023 Amendment Act. Before that, the President would simply appoint the election commissioners. At least until 1989, the practice was it was the ongoing practice and it was not very formalized in that sense. And they would appoint, the President would appoint the election commissioners with the or on the advice of the Council of Ministers. Now, of course, we've already discussed in the previous videos the functions of the Election Commission. And of course, we've also discussed that the Election Commission ought to be independent. They do not ought to be influenced by the executive in Anyway, to ensure that independence, there is this security of tenure. However, they can also be removed from their position before the expiry of their tenure by the president when both houses of the parliament pass a resolution for their removal by a special majority. So their removal is subject to special majority by both houses of the parliament, the Lok Sabha as well as the Rajya Sabha. And what does the special majority mean? So special majority means 2/3 of members present and voting and over 50% or a majority of, simple majority of the total membership of the house. Now, if you want more detail on this concept, you'll have to go back and check out the other videos that we've done on this concept of special majority, and I've explained there in details with a lot of examples as to what is this concept in detail. All right. So here, this is the concept of special majority, and it is subject to this, that the election commissioners can be removed before the expiry of the term by the president. Now, with this in mind, let's try to arrive at the correct answer. So let's correctly talk about the tenure and the removal conditions of the Chief Election Commissioner. Option A says 6-year term, removable by President on the advice of Council of Ministers. No, this is in fact not correct. And imagine if this were the case, then the Election Commission would actually lose its independence, because then they would be subject to the influence of the executive. Option B says 6-year term or till 65 years, removable only through special majority resolution of both houses of the parliament. This is exactly what we have just discussed in quite some detail, and therefore this is our correct answer. Which of the following demonstrates the independence of the Election Commission? So we have discussed the necessity of the independence of the Election Commission, and we'll now see what demonstrates their independence. So option A says it depends on the Ministry of Home Affairs for transfers of officers. So this is incorrect. Why? Because the Election Commission of India is in fact dependent on the Ministry of Home Affairs, let's say for the deployment of the CAPF in areas where elections are conducted. Of course, they are dependent. But when it comes to transfer of officers during elections, the EC acts independently. When it pertains to this particular matter, the Election Commission acts independently and not dependent on the Ministry of Home Affairs. Option B says, and therefore we can rule this out. Option B says it can postpone or cancel an election if a free and fair poll is not possible. And this we have seen several times in the past. For example, in 2002 Gujarat Assembly elections, the EC postponed it for quite a few months because fair and free election could not be possible at that point of time in Gujarat. So this demonstrates their independence. Option C says its expenditure is approved annually by the cabinet. Actually, not true. The expenses of the EC is non-votable and is charged on the consolidated fund of India, which means it is not subject to approval by the cabinet or the parliament. So this option again can be ruled out, and again if it were true, then it would demonstrate dependence instead of independence. Option D says its decisions can be vetoed by parliament. So the decisions of the EC are final and binding. and they cannot be vetoed by the Parliament. If they were, or if they could be vetoed by the Parliament, this would demonstrate dependence or influence in place of independence or autonomy of the Election Commission. Therefore, option B is our correct answer. Now, before we move forward, I would like to draw your attention to the ongoing Diwali sale by Drishti IAS from 14th to 18th October, where you can now get your NCERT Live Online Course at 50% off. So please hurry up and avail this offer. And the offer is valid till 18th October. And for more information, you can either click the link in the description box or dial 87501 87501. So let me take you to today's practice question. It was a PYQ incidentally that was asked in one of the recent years. So if you like today's session, kindly like, share and subscribe, and please send me your answers in the comment section. Thanks for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.